2 weeks ago, I released my review of the new Sigma 50mm f1.4 art lens. Well, it must be 50mm February because today Sony is announcing this, their own 50mm f1.4 G Master. Let's get undone.
Gerald Undone. He's crazy.
What's happening, everybody? I'm Gerald Undone, and sticking feathers up your butt does not make you a chicken. So, for disclosure, Sony lent me this lens to make this video. I don't get to keep it, no money changed hands, and Sony does not get any input on this video's production or get to preview it before it's posted. And the same goes for Sigma with their 50mm, but that was for the previous video, but I'm still borrowing it under that same terms. Not sponsored, no money, no preview. This video does have an actual sponsor though, and that's Storyblocks. And also, I'd like to continue to thank Camera Canada for the previous lenses that they lent me for that comparison I did for the Sigma. Now, if you haven't watched that previous video on the review of the new DGDN art lens from Sigma, I highly recommend that you do because it would take way too long for me to re-compare all of those lenses again against this new one. So we're gonna be just going off of the conclusions of that previous video and comparing that to this new Sony lens. So please watch the video first if you're seriously considering buying one of these 50mm lenses, because I think collectively both videos will really paint a clear picture for you. Now, when it comes to the actual build and features of this new lens, it is nearly identical, which I think is important, to the other recent G Masters that Sony's been making in the primes, the 35, 1.4, for example. I have it right here, and you can see that my 35 on the right compared to the 50mm, they're almost, like from a distance, you can't really tell the difference, and weight-wise, they're really hard to tell from just the hand. There's just a few more features that are now on the 50mm lens, which I appreciate. First off, there's now 2 function buttons instead of just 1. And there's also the addition of an iris lock switch, which I've said in recent videos that I really like because it stops me from getting in that place where I have the aperture set halfway between A and f16, and then you can't change it on your camera and you're wondering what's going on. You can put it on A and lock it, and then you're only controlling it on your camera. But if you do choose to control it on the lens, it goes all the way from f1.4 to f16, and of course you can do that clicked or declicked, whichever you prefer. And then as usual, you have your AF/MF switch. Now, when it comes to weather sealing, Sony rates this lens as being dust and moisture resistant, but in all the press briefs, they always mention they're not 100% dust and moisture proof, just resistant. And there's also the fluorine coating on the front element to repel water and oil. And there is a pretty sizable gasket around the lens mount, which is nice to see. Now, compared to the Sigma, the more recent one, the DGDN, that's the one we're going to be focusing on for this comparison. Most of the features are the same on both lenses, which is great. There's an extra function button on the Sony lens, and the Sony lens is, considerably shorter. It's noticeably lighter. I wouldn't say significant, but it is noticeably lighter. The Sigma comes in at 660 grams, and the Sony G Master is 516 grams. Now, when it comes to focusing, regarding autofocus first, this is using Sony's latest and greatest XD linear motors, which are fast, silent, highly responsive, great for photo and for video, no complaints about them. Probably some of the best focus motors in the business. And usually I would say that they're leaps and bounds ahead of what Sigma's doing. But as I mentioned in the previous video, this new lens from Sigma is their first prime to have their new fast linear motors. So in this case, the delta between the two is much, much smaller than it used to be. And for many users, they probably won't even notice the difference. Manual focus is a different story though. As I mentioned in my Sigma video, the focus ring on the Sigma lens is very large and nicely dampened, and it feels good to move, but the focus response for Sony cameras is non-linear, meaning that if you move it faster, it moves more than if you move it slower. It doesn't have set points. This means that you can get good focus pulls because it is well dampened and the throw is very long if you move it slow, but the focus pulls aren't repeatable. You're gonna have a hard time doing the exact same pull because it's not linear. The Sony lens, on the other hand, is perfectly linear, and that's great. So you can do repeatable pulls, but I find it a little bit sloppier, the focus ring. It's a little bit looser, a little bit smaller. Now, when it comes to focus breathing, I did a roundup of these lenses, the 3 that we talked about before, and found that the new Sigma was actually, probably the worst, unfortunately. The G Master was going to be a big thing for me because focus breathing has been an issue on these G Masters, and they told me it was improved, and it is. It's not gone, but compared to the other 50mm that we are comparing it to, including the 1.2 version, this has the best focus breathing performance that I've seen. And keep in mind that unlike the Sigma, if you do have one of the Sony cameras that has the focus breathing compensation option, it will work with this lens to completely eliminate the focus breathing Now, I touched on that f1.2 G Master version from Sony, and I don't have that with me today to show you any direct comparisons, but I have already used that lens extensively and reviewed it, and I have a pretty good memory of that lens. And when I did my press brief with Sony, they also were able to share with me some MTF charts showing the comparison between the 1.4 and the 1.2. Now, I can't share those with you directly because they are, secret MTF charts, if you will. But in that, what I observed basically in the comparison shots and the MTF charts is that wide open, the 1.4 and the 1.2 are pretty similar in the center. Out towards the corners, the 1.4 wide open performs better than the 1.2. In the center, it's remarkable that they're both equally as sharp, more remarkable to the 1.2. But when you stop down both lenses, the sort of perfect sharpness on both lenses is achieved sooner on the 1.2. So you'll get the best results out of that lens at a wider aperture than you would on the 1.4. Let's say it's a 1.8 versus an f2. So you're going to get that extra third stop on the 1.2 when achieving equal sharpness, if that makes sense. All right, now let's open up Lightroom and I will show you the images that I actually have captured to compare. And once again, I'm using the same cameras that I was using in the previous videos. So the A1 and the A7R5, high megapixel. And I have the profiles turned off on all these lenses so we can see how they look in their uncorrected state. Okay, so it looks like there's actually an update for Lightroom. So while we wait for that to install, why don't I tell you about today's sponsor, Storyblocks. So sometimes you don't have the shot you need, and there's no way you're going to be able to go out and get it before you run out of time, run out of money, or run out of patience by completely derailing your creative momentum. And that's where Storyblocks comes in. Storyblocks is a stock media platform that boasts a massive library of high-quality assets aimed to strengthen your video production. Their subscription model provides predictable costs, unlimited downloads, and no messing around with royalty fees or complicated licensing. They have ample 4K and HD video files, images, and motion graphics templates that you can use worry-free for both your personal and commercial projects. And the platform is intuitive and easy to use, and new content is added regularly with a focus on in-demand keywords to deliver up-to-date assets to satisfy your project. And if you're a Premiere user, Storyblocks now has a plugin that integrates its entire library right into Premiere Pro. If you've never browsed Storyblocks before, I think you'll be truly impressed by just how exhaustive and useful their library is, and I encourage you to learn more about them by using the link in the description below. So this first shot is to just show the longitudinal chromatic aberration, because the chromatic aberration was one of the biggest weaknesses that I had with the Sigma. So if we take a look here, I would say that we're getting somewhat similar results, but maybe slightly better on the G Master, which is on the left. Okay, now for this one, same thing, Sony on the left, Sigma on the right. This one we're gonna look at lateral chromatic aberration, vignetting, and distortion. And we can see that there actually is more vignetting on the Sigma. As far as distortion though, maybe slightly worse on the Sigma. Definitely both have some noticeable pincushion distortion here. Maybe the Sigma's slightly worse, but it's minor, but the vignetting is significant. I'm actually noticing the Sony is a little bit sharper here in the center, and I am noticing, again, more chromatic aberration laterally on the Sigma, which was the biggest issue I noticed with the Sigma, was that red fringing on everything. And you can see as we move across that the Sigma has it where the Sony doesn't. Let's take a look down over here for some sharpness as we move further across. Again, much more pronounced chromatic aberration on the Sigma, less so on the Sony. Sharpness though, as we move out, you're pulling hairs here to try and determine which one of these is sharper. They're both in pretty good shape, I would say. To go a little further into that center versus corner sharpness, here's a shot where we focused right in the center of this fence. Now here I would say the Sony does look a little bit sharper. We're at like 230% and it's minor, but I'm seeing a little bit more softness around here than I am here. A little bit of a win in the center to the Sony for sure. And if we go to the edges, this is where I find that the differences are pretty marginal, just like we saw on the previous chart. Again, maybe like a really, really small win here for the Sony, but very, very minor. But we are seeing that vignetting again, and maybe slightly more distortion. Now, this was a test that I did with all the lenses where I stopped them down 1.4, f2, and then f2.8, and we looked at the text here. And this highlighted sort of the biggest weakness of the Sigma, and then also where it resolves itself. So wide open on both lenses, Sony on the left, you can see there is much less chromatic aberration and better sharpness wide open in the center on the Sony than there is on the Sigma. And this, as we go across the frame, you can see that that's the case here. But if we stop down to f2, the Sigma improves dramatically with the chromatic aberration. The Sony still wins, and at f2, the Sony achieves almost its like ideal sharpness already. You don't even have to really go to 2.8 on this lens, but you can see at f2, the Sony is terrific. and the Sigma has just improved to maybe where the Sony was at 1.4. And then now finally at 2.8, I would say they seem interchangeable. The chromatic aberration is pretty much resolved in the Sigma, and they look about the same to me. So 2.8, this almost looks like the same lens to me at 2.8. Now, another thing I talked about a lot in the previous video was close focusing, and I found that the Sigmas did better than the planar when it came to close focusing. Not only could you get closer and have a bigger reproduction, but it was sharper when doing so. It was able to prevent some aberration that sort of gives that glistening softness on really close focused subjects. And I would say the same is actually true. I still think the Sigma is the choice if you like to close focus a lot. Here, you can see the Sigma on the right is slightly larger. There's slightly greater reproduction when at the closest possible focus point. And if we punch in the center here, we can see that the logo is slightly sharper and there is more detail on the Sigma than there is on the Sony. So the Sigmas are still doing best for close focusing. It's minor, again, but if you're somebody who close focuses a tremendous amount, well, again, like I said in the previous video, don't buy 50mm for that purpose, but if you really like 50mm and you like to close focus, the Sigma is still the better choice. And the actual numbers on that are 0.41 meters or 1.35 feet. That's the minimum focusing distance on the new Sony 50mm f1.4 G Master. And by the way, the front filter thread is a 67mm, the same as the 35 G Master and so on. Okay, now let's take a look at Bokeh, and we can see here that they're actually quite similar from a distance. Let's punch in and have a closer look. Yeah, this is really close. They're both using an 11-bladed iris. We have slightly bigger orbs on the Sigma because, again, I do these shots at minimum focus. So because the minimum focus is closer on the Sigma, then you get a bigger out of focus orb in the background. But that's the reason why it's different. Instead, we're just looking at the texture of it. They both do well to not have much of an outer membrane. They both do well to minimize onion ringing. The Sigma is maybe slightly busier than the Sony, but maybe slightly smoother in the way the iris shapes. I mean, very, very similar, I would say. Let's stop them both down to f2 and see what happens. Yeah, same. Maybe slightly more circular on the Sigma, but slightly busier on the Sigma. But again, I would not choose between these lenses based on the Bokeh. They're very, very, very similar. Here is an image that I took at f16 on the Sony, if you want to look at some Sunstars. And flare, as expected from a G Master, is incredibly well controlled. I was darting around a tree trying to get the sun to come in, and it barely lost any contrast in the frame, and there's very little ghosting and artifacts. Now, those texture and detail shots that I did on the Sigma for the previous video, I also did them on the G Master because I had the lens at the same time. I still wanted to talk about it in that previous video, but obviously it was under embargo. But so we can actually look at them side by side like this. And I find that for just this kind of purpose, where chromatic aberration isn't an issue, vignetting isn't an issue, that kind of thing, where you're just, shooting some stuff at medium close range and just looking at some details, they both do a really, really good job. And at first glance, hard to even really tell the difference between them. Like they're so similar. Here's another example where they look almost identical. Let's punch in the middle here. Let's get even closer. Yeah, I mean, these are so close. Yeah, slight difference in focus point, but extremely similar. Even the way that it transitions out of focus, the way that just the sort of the blur in the background is very similar. Again, look at the way it transitions out of focus. Look at the color. They're so similar. And even punching in. So, we can do test charts. And in that case, the Sony sort of justifies its price increase by saying, look, I am better. I'm better at chromatic aberration. I'm better at being sharper sooner in aperture when it comes to the very fine details when you zoom in. And I'll give that to him. This is the better lens optically, unless close focusing at the absolute cusp is important to you. But when it comes to just taking photos of random things, you can hardly tell the difference, other than some vignetting, So, but there's profiles for that. Again, so if you put profiles on, you can't tell the difference really between these two lenses when just shooting practically. When shooting tests, you can. So it comes down to that, do you want is money no issue and you just want the best 1.4? This new Sony is the best 1.4 and it's smaller and lighter and it matches if you have other G Masters like the 35 or the 24. You're going to get a more, similar experience in that regard. Or if you rig it up in a certain way, or if you use gimbals a lot and you want to swap the lenses around, you're going to have a convenience in knowing the lenses are similar in size and weight. You could say the same thing actually if you've been buying the Sigmas as well. If you got their 35 or 85, then you're going to get those conveniences as well. But if you're already on the Sony system and you want to keep the lens is congruent, then you get that advantage. It is smaller and lighter. It does feel better in the hand. It feels better on a Sony body when it comes to balance than the Sigma. The Sigma does still have a bit of that sort of elongated vibe that gives it a little bit of a forward lean in your wrist when you use it. So overall, the Sony is a superior lens. And if that's all you wanted to know, it's better in pretty much every regard except for close focusing. But it's 50% more than the Sigma lens. And that 50%, in my opinion, only really shows up as being worth it, if you will, in those almost synthetic sort of test charts. It doesn't show up in the real world, not 50% better, 5, 10, 15% more money maybe, but not 50% more money. 2 weeks ago, I released my review of the new 2 weeks ago, I released my review of the new 60mm. 2 weeks ago, I released my review of the new Sigma 50mm f1.4. Well, it must be 50mm February because today. So for disclosure, Sony lent me this lens to make this video. They don't get to keep it. They don't get to keep it. I don't get to keep it. They can keep it if they want. That's up to them. All right. I'm done.